Welcome to Florida's Cannabis News Podcast, a weekly podcast exploring the legal, political, and economic changes to Florida's cannabis industry, covering important news and events for Florida cannabis businesses and professionals. Sit back and relax. Florida's Cannabis News Podcast begins now.
Hey everybody, today is November 17th, 2020, and you're tuned in to Florida's Cannabis News Podcast. As always, this is your host David, and I hope you had a great weekend. I, for one, am already thinking about Thanksgiving next week. I'm looking forward to that sweet potato casserole and NFL football all day. Today we are continuing our 5-part series on cannabis taxation. Specifically today in part 3, we are talking everything 280E and its impact on the United States cannabis industry. In this episode, we will go through a short history of United States cannabis markets, the evolution of cannabis as a legal commodity in the United States. We'll then dive into how Section 280E is outdated because the sale of cannabis is now legal in parts of the country, as you probably know. On top of that, we will talk about how 280E does not achieve any of the goals the drafters of the Section 280E set out when they enacted the law. So in this episode, in order to understand more about how 280E came to be, we have to break down today's United States cannabis industry and talk about what that looks like. We must talk about how 280E is now punishing legal businesses, which, as you recall, was not the intent of 280E. The intent of 280E was to punish illegal businesses. And in order to understand why 280E is outdated, you need to see how 280E is actually helping illegal drug dealers today. This is an awesome episode because we're finally tying 280E into today's cannabis landscape in the United States. I'm looking forward to unpacking everything with everybody. But before we dive into today's episode, I do want to shout out a couple of listeners, or more than a couple. I was taking a look at the stats of the podcast yesterday, and we have many listeners in Brazil, a few in Egypt, 2 in Turkey, more than a dozen in India, and 1 listener in Russia. So I just want to shout you guys out, the international community. You are awesome, not even located in Florida, but I don't know, maybe you're an investor in the cannabis space, United States MSOs. That's really cool that the podcast is getting out to those countries. So shout out to you guys, shout out to the international listeners. And with that being said, let's dive right into part 3. The Nixon and Regan administrations set the stage for such low support for cannabis reform going into Bill Clinton's presidency in 1992. Vilifying and marketing cannabis to the American public as a threat successfully maintained the status quo no-tolerance drug policies, but support for legalization began to increase. Americans who experimented with cannabis saw that they did not become murderers or college dropouts. Their experience with cannabis was far less evil than the government warned for decades. The traditional war on drug advertisements started to evoke humor rather than fear, and the generation that led the counterculture movement started to have children. From 1996 to 2000, 7 states, including California, passed medical cannabis laws, which positively affected public opinion of the plant. Now, breaking down, let's do a quick short history of United States cannabis markets. The cannabis industry is similar to any other traditional agricultural industry. Farmers grow the crop in greenhouses or outdoors. They regularly tend to the crop, and they develop irrigation systems to achieve the best yield. Farmers also research how to best prevent pests and diseases, which pesticides are safe and effective, and how genes and the environment affect the production of key plant chemicals like THC and CBD. As Americans were exposed to functioning and legal cannabis markets, more states soon followed. By 2000, support for cannabis legalization polled at 31% among Americans. In 2013, 58% of Americans supported legalizing cannabis. In 2019, with over 66% of Americans supporting the legalization of cannabis, 33 states and D.C. have state-regulated medicinal or adult-use cannabis markets, and we know on the election that happened last week, we could add 5 more to that list. Legal cannabis markets stimulate state economies and fight the opioid crisis that claims tens of thousands of lives each year. For example, Florida, with a comparatively limited medical cannabis program, has over right now 400,000 registered medical cannabis patients within 4 years of implementing their program. In 2018, Florida was projected to generate between $200 million and $300 million in sales revenue, a high projection for such a young and limited program that does not sell edible products, which is the second most delivery method among consumers. But now we could add on edibles to that equation. With Governor Ron DeSantis' recent signing of SB 182 back in 2019, that was the bill that allowed dispensaries to sell the whole flower. That projection has increased in 2019 and going into 2021. Now, states vary in how they regulate their respective cannabis programs. Some states, like Florida, have implemented a vertically integrated market where MMTCs, medical marijuana treatment centers, sometimes referred to as dispensaries, sell cannabis only to registered patients. Now, we know in a vertically integrated system, a cannabis business must grow, cultivate, process, deliver, and sell cannabis. This all in-house process is coined seed to sale in our industry. Now, other states implement horizontally integrated markets where licenses are awarded per sector. For instance, if a business owner only wanted to cultivate, she would apply for a license for solely cultivation. If a business owner wanted to only operate retail stores, she would apply for a license just for retail operations. As states started to implement their cannabis programs, the federal government prosecuted violators of the CSA regardless if the violators complied with their state's law. But as public opinion about the plant continued to shift and more states legalized the plant, the Department of Justice, the DOJ, lowered their prosecution priority for state legal cannabis businesses. In 2009, Deputy United States Attorney David Ogden issued the Ogden Memo, which basically announced that the DOJ would not focus their prosecutorial resources to pursue cannabis companies who were in, quote, clear and unambiguous compliance with their state's cannabis laws. In 2011, Deputy United States Attorney James Cole reaffirmed the DOJ's position from the Ogden Memo, but reminded cannabis business owners that they're still in violation of the CSA, even though they might comply with state law. In 2013, the DOJ, speaking directly to states who wanted to legalize the plant, announced in the 2013 Cole Memo that state legislation would only be tolerated if the state provided tight control of the market. After the DOJ issued the 2013 Cole Memo, states built their cannabis licensing and taxation regulations to comply with the DOJ's guidelines. States and cannabis business owners are willing to operate under the DOJ guidelines because the memorandums eased relationships between cannabis businesses and ancillary businesses like landlords, municipal governments, and security companies. So here we could see the federal government working hand in hand with business owners to kind of facilitate this market, even with the federal prohibition in place. Now, of course, in 2018, Attorney General Jeff Sessions reintroduced tension and uncertainty amongst cannabis business owners when he rescinded the 2013 Cole Memo. In issuing the Sessions Memo, Sessions rescinded all guidance on cannabis enforcement, which gave U.S. attorneys full discretion to determine to what extent they should enforce federal law. Ironically, Attorney General Sessions pushed the cannabis conversation forward at the federal level because just 2 months later, Congress added a rider to the DOJ's 2018 budget. Now, this rider countered Attorney Jeff Sessions' rescission of the 2013 Cole Memo because the rider forbade the DOJ from spending any of the budget prosecuting medical cannabis dispensaries or patients, thus essentially reviving the ideals of the 2013 Cole Memo. Now, confidence among stakeholders in the cannabis industry continued to grow when President Trump's Attorney General nominee, William Barr, stated in his confirmation hearing in January of 2019, quote, "My approach is not to upset the settled expectations and the reliant interests that have arisen out of the 2013 Cole memo." So, even though the DOJ's attitude towards cannabis has shifted to a more accepting view of the industry, remember, we're seeing the DOJ kind of work to make this industry work, the application of Section 280E has not evolved. Now, let's talk about why Section 280E is outdated. And Section 280E is outdated now because the sale of cannabis is a legal business in the United States. Cannabis businesses in any medical or adult use market must adhere to Section 280E no matter what. And as a result, these businesses may only deduct their costs of goods sold as a business expense. And I was speaking to a group of law students the other day just about this very issue. And costs of goods sold includes seeds, soil, water, nutrients, and expenses related to the cultivation and harvesting of the plant. But Section 280E does not significantly affect cultivators because the overwhelming majority of their business expenses do fall under cost of goods sold. However, that's only part of the industry. Costs associated with the distribution, the sale, the administration, the management, promotion, advertisement, and overhead and support are not allowable business deductions, which is the other 95% of the industry. Now, these costs include rent, employee salaries, shipping, contractors, legal fees, management, accounting. I mean, basically everything under the sun. Utilities like electricity, internet, phone services, health insurance, rent, overhead, and compliance. For most companies, a large percentage of the overall costs do not fall into cost of goods sold. So for most companies, almost 95% of their costs of their business are not going to be deductible. Now, paying taxes on gross receipts creates a significant tax burden, which in many cases can make a company unprofitable. Without these deductions available, legal cannabis business owners must pay taxes on all of their revenue without deducting business expenses to reduce their taxable income. State legal cannabis business owners are being unfairly treated compared to any other business, legal or illegal, because cannabis business owners cannot deduct business expenses, thus, as I said, paying taxes on gross receipts rather than net income. Now, here's the kicker. By disallowing cannabis businesses owners the opportunity to deduct business expenses, the Internal Revenue Code converts an income tax into a gross receipts tax. Now, this tax rate is effectively 70% or higher compared to the average tax rate of 21%. Here's the conclusion. Congress punishes cannabis business owners who try to comply with the law while creating a competitive advantage for black market dealers that Section 280E was actually enacted to punish. Section 280E is now punishing legitimate businesses, which is not the intent of Section 280E. Looking back at the legislative record suggests that 280E was enacted to punish illegal drug dealers, not legal businesses. Today, the distinction between legal cannabis businesses and illegal drug trafficking is material. The former distributes lab-tested medicine to patients, while the latter sells unregulated substances to consumers who could be underage. Now, since the enactment of Section 280E, the federal government's opinion on cannabis businesses evolved to a more accepting perspective, and the opinion of cannabis at the global level has changed. Countries such as Germany, Italy, Mexico, Switzerland, Australia, Argentina, and the United Kingdom have all legalized cannabis as a medicine. In 2018, Canada became the first G5 country to legalize adult use at the federal level. In January of 2019, the World Health Organization proposed rescheduling cannabis within international law because the current classification of cannabis is not consistent with the research showing the medicinal benefits of the plant. Now, despite the slow and gradual implementation of legal cannabis programs, cannabis companies are quickly becoming global players. For example, one Canadian cannabis company, Aurora, operates in 24 countries. U.S. consumer spending on legal cannabis reached over $10 billion in 2018. Now, even if no other states reformed their laws, cannabis spending is expected to top $26 billion by 2025. In late 2018, a Gallup poll showed 2/3 of Americans supported the legalization of cannabis in some form. This momentum underscores the immediate need to reform Section 280E to fully realize the potential for cannabis in the United States economy. The legal cannabis industry is scaling, and Section 280E does not fit within what the U.S. and global markets have become. Now, looking back, when Congress passed Section 280E into law, no state in 1982 had enacted legislation legalizing any form of cannabis. To Congress's credit, actually, in 1982, Congress did not suspect legal drug trafficking would be one day a viable business model. In 2019, with 33 states and DC now, having hosted or a medicinal or adult use cannabis market, Section 280E is now being applied to legal businesses, that is, state legal, more often than it is to the types of illegal drug dealers the drafters intended to penalize. Although Schedule 1 and 2 substances might make up the greater majority of the illegal drug trade, Section 280E does not apply to drug traffickers who sell Schedule 3, Schedule 4, or Schedule 5 substances. As applied in today's market, Section 280E contradicts itself. The goal of Section 280E was to punish illegal drug traffickers, not legal businesses. The legislative record points to illegal drug traffickers as the targets of 280E, but today the IRS is applying 280E to cannabis businesses in states that have legalized the market in some form. Why? Because cannabis is still a Schedule 1 substance under federal law. Now, while some states legalize cannabis for medicinal or adult use, federal law still considers the plant illegal, which means the IRS can continue and does continue to impose Section 280E on legal businesses that, quote, traffic the plant while they file their federal income tax, or when they file it. As a result, state legal cannabis businesses are struggling to survive because they have virtually no ability to deduct business expenses compared to other businesses, remember, legal or illegal, who are able to deduct rent on business property, salaries and wages, advertising, licensing fees, repairs, and legal fees. With state markets online and operating, and Congress allowing the markets to grow without worry of federal prosecution by the DOJ, Section 280E remains an obstacle for state cannabis businesses because it denies state legal cannabis business owners any deduction for any business expense except for cost of goods sold. Now, despite the change in law that we see almost every election cycle at the state level, federal law has not changed, but this podcast episode proposes the need to. Here, let's talk about how Section 280E does not satisfy any IRS or any war on drug policy goals. The goals of the war on drugs were to combat the flow of illegal drugs into the United States, significantly reduce illegal drug use, and educate the public about illegal drugs and substances. 280E does not reduce the flow of illegal drugs into the United States. It's actually indirectly subsidizing the black market. Every state is contending with an illicit market that composed of more than 85% of cannabis sales in North America in 2016. In 2018, 2 years after Massachusetts legalized cannabis, 90% of cannabis sales in the state were from the black market. In 2019, cannabis sales in California totaled roughly $12 billion, and $8.7 billion of that was generated by the black market. The black market is unregulated, thus their products are not likely to be lab tested. Products from the black market pose a danger to human health. Recently, an outbreak of lung injury associated with the use of vape products spread across the United States that hospitalized over 2,600 people. The Center for Disease Control and the Federal Food Drug Administration recommended people not use vaping products from informal sources like the black market. Now, of 50% of the patients who reported where they purchased their devices, 78% of them reported informal sources. A 2018 study published by eSolutions reported that 18% of respondents purchased cannabis from the black market due to the black market having cheaper products and no tax. So not only do black market operations undercut legal obstacles from the start, like licensing requirements, permit requirements, but add on Section 280E that cripples the legal market's potential to scale, provide cheaper medicine, donate to charity, and give raises to their employees. The burden Section 280E, those burdens make it less appealing to a potential employee, consumer, or patient to go to the legal market. But because of the business owner's inability to expand, patients have to drive upwards of 60 miles sometimes to get their medicine. State-imposed lab testing for pesticides can cost upwards of $30,000 per year out of pocket, which they will not be able to deduct. And while these tests are absolutely necessary to make the legal market safe for consumers, cannabis businesses cannot deduct these tests as a business expense. Even though these business expenses are legal, thus deductible under Section 162, cannabis businesses are forced to inflate prices in their products in order to make up for their inability to deduct business expenses. Consequently, Section 280E is pulling consumers and patients into the black market because the prices are cheaper. The black market dealers don't have to deal with any of this. Until Section 280E is modernized to allow cannabis companies to deduct similar expenses taken by basically every other industry in the world, patients and adult use consumers will continue to use the cheaper, unregulated, illicit market cannabis products. If the federal government truly wants to deter illegal drug use and abuse, they should tax cannabis businesses on a net income basis rather than a gross receipts basis. Taxing cannabis businesses on a net income basis would make it less profitable for black market sellers to make illegal sales, thus diverting more business through the legal regulatory channels. States and municipalities are taking notice of how tax laws like Section 280E strengthen the competitive position of black markets, thus hurting the legal businesses. In 2017, Colorado reduced its state cannabis tax in order to remain competitive with the black market. More recently, a California state bill was introduced specifically to, quote, protect legitimate tax-paying businesses and stop the illegal illicit market. Over time, Section 280E is also not going to help the IRS raise revenue, which is their main responsibility. Now, let's go back to the public policy doctrine. In molding the doctrine, the Supreme Court tried to balance the public's uneasiness toward illegal activities and balance that with the code's intent to raise revenue by taxing income derived from any source. Congress's codification of Section 280E did not evenly balance the two. Section 280E tips the public's uneasiness to far outweigh the code's intent to raise revenue. Yes, the IRS is using Section 280E to generate tax revenue, but these revenues are only going to last so long. If Congress does not reform Section 280E, it's reasonable to think the IRS will eventually tax the cannabis industry out of business and as a result lose out on a future gold mine of a market. In fact, California officials blamed the growth of the illicit market for their underachieving tax revenues in recent years. Taxing cannabis businesses on a net income basis would allow the businesses to reach sustainability, and it would in turn lead to the United States to reap tax revenues for years to come. It's ruining the long game for the sustainability and the growth of the market. Okay, so you just listened to part 3 of our 5-part series on Section 280E. It's truly fascinating for me to see how over time, due to the changes in society, it shows that, society itself makes certain laws outdated and no longer applicable. With the rise of legitimate United States cannabis markets popping up all over our country since the 90s, starting with California, it was us, the people, us who made 280E outdated. It was because of the efforts of the advocates, the nonprofit organizations like NORML, and the leaders in politics, and the leaders of the legal cannabis industry itself, the movement. It was because of their efforts that helped build the way and helped build what we see today as our current cannabis landscape, our current legal cannabis landscape. And now looking back at certain laws like 280E, we can see the shift in society's perspective on the plant to a more accepting perspective of the plant as a medicine. And now we're picking up the pieces still of the war on drugs. The companies who are operating in today's U.S. cannabis markets are still battling 280E, and that is the topic we will start to tap into later this week in part 4 and see how companies today are still dealing with this draconian law. We are also going to explore legislative solutions to 280E and what cannabis markets will look like in the future without 280E in place. So some housekeeping items before I let you guys go. If you think I do a decent job of breaking down the laws and analyzing cannabis news, please consider rating the show, leaving a review, and subscribing. Every review helps us get the podcast in front of more eyeballs and spreads the word and spreads the education I'm trying to provide to the listeners about the cannabis industry. My goal with the podcast is to help normalize the industry and continue to be a pioneer, as we've seen throughout this 5-part series of people advocating for the medicinal use of this plant. I also recommend visiting our website, floridacannabispod.com, signing up for my free newsletter. This is just simply an email newsletter, super simple. I send episodes directly to your inbox, no spam, nothing like that, not trying to waste your time. Okay, second piece of housekeeping, if there is a product or an event you are trying to get a spotlight on, please consider reaching out to me on Twitter, which is at FLCannabisPod. Hit me up on Instagram, same thing, FLCannabisPod, or shoot me an email, david@floridacannabispod.com, and let's get the ball rolling on that. And I would be happy to pub any event or product that you think would be applicable to our audience. Thank you for listening as always, and I will see you next time on Florida's Cannabis News Podcast.